Hello everyone. So this is a very quick little video, kind of a mini lecture. I don't do these too frequently in this class, but I should feel like I should record a few for you all. I'm going to try and keep these mini lectures to the most trending and most researched and evidence-based practices. So the very first one, this video, I would like to talk about cognitive load theory as it pertains to instructional materials or videos or worksheets or anything that we have our students work with as they build their understanding of an outcome or a skill or a competency or a set of knowledge. So this series and this mini lecture is evidence-based teaching strategies to maximize student learning. And this very first one is on cognitive load theory as it pertains to instructional materials. So, cognitive load theory is a theory of the most effective way to maximize the performance of our students' cognitive ability. You have to filter out the inessentials from the instructional materials in the course so that the students can focus on the most pertinent and important things, right? That's kind of what we've been reaching with backward design. We want to focus our planning and our students' experiences in the classroom upon an outcome or a very effective, meaningful thing. So that's kind of why we've been talking about backward design and why people like backward design so much, is that it almost does this. It's been around longer than cognitive load theory, as far as cognitive load theory and instruction and teaching and learning have intersected. But it kind of fits into this topic. So why consider cognitive load theory as it intersects with instructional materials into our teaching practices? It provides a theoretical and empirical support for explicit models of instruction, right? And as we've learned about Malcolm Knowles, we need to make learning explicit, clear. There's no magic show going on with learning. Do these things, practice, assess, repeat, and you'll get where you want to be from the student perspective. It's context specific. Teachers show students what to do and how to do it rather than having them discover or construct information for themselves. So again, this cognitive load theory is all about the explicit, direct instruction of teaching and learning. So if that's not your forte, or if maybe you have some students who are a little bit more driven and motivated by their own exploration and their own internal motivation, then use that, but think about this as we think about direct instruction, because we always do direct instruction at some point, somewhere, when we're clarifying or we're providing some materials or something like that. And then cognitive load theory is about optimizing the load on students' working memories to help maximize their learning. This is the key. So cognitive load. What is the load of new information upon an individual's working memory, right? And it's important. We'll go over kind of working memory and cognitive load and those terms in a second here. But it's important to remember that cognitive load theory is all about optimizing the load on students' working memories to help maximize their learning. If there are all these images and all of these things overloading their working memory, what they're working with in the moment with you or with the materials or with peers, then their ability to learn is limited. And then finally, this theory and the resulting strategies provides us with a framework for introducing novel information with all learners. Novel information, another way to say new information. So think about this framework as you are preparing instructional materials or lecturing or working with students on new information. So let's talk about cognitive architecture. This is the key to understanding cognitive load theory. And the image on the right is a pretty good one, and it explains it quite well. So our working memory, over here, the top one, is the processing space for new information. That's what we're working on when we're doing new things or doing tasks around the office or home or in the classroom. It's the memory that we're working with in the moment. Then we have overload, where learning can be slowed or even stopped if our working memory is overloaded. So if there's too much stimuli or too much information, think about scenarios where your students are reading a brick of text, like 80, 90 pages of text. Is that the best way for them to understand the concept? It could be, but another way to do it is for us to break it up, maybe use some imagery, some visual organizers, things like that, to lessen the load of just having to read 90 pages. So overload shows up in a different ways. It could also be how many times you try and explain something, or something like that. But it's all about too much information coming in to our working memory. So then learning occurs when the novel information that we're working with or our students are practicing, we maybe just did a PowerPoint on, and they're introducing and they're practicing things. The learning is when that new information, the new skill, the new competency moves from working memory into our long-term memory, right? And that comes with repetition. They have to practice it a few times, maybe more than a few times, to really get it, to be able to apply it on a test, or remember it long term. So learning in this cognitive load theory is framed as when new information, new skills, new competencies move from working memory through lots of practice and success into our students' long-term memory. So how do we get things to our long-term memory? How do we learn things? How do our students learn things? The best and the quickest and the most effective way is to optimize the load on the working memory. So that's what we're going to spend the rest of this little video on. I'm going to give you about 11 different ways to criticize and also design, to inform your designs of instructional materials, and that's worksheets, visual organizers, prompts, your PowerPoints, instructional videos. These evidence things these 11 tips will go a long way for you. So that's kind of the idea. So as the new information comes into our working memory, and our students practice it and practice it and practice it and assess and experience some success with it, it moves into our long-term memory, and thus they have learned it. And to learn it the easiest way, the most effective way on time and student effort, we need to optimize the load through these 11 little hints and tips that I will provide for you. So let's talk about instructional design. This is another space that kind of, you will hear this phrase quite a bit. That's what I do during the day. I kind of moved out of adult ed, even though I still teach and still am heavily involved in adult ed, and I still teach adults. I am now an instructional designer. So this work and these hints and tips that I'll give you in a moment here, I apply to learners of all types. This is applicable to kids in kindergarten and adults at 65, or adults in their 30s or 20s working on their PhD. The hints and tips that I will provide to you are applicable to all learners everywhere, not just adult ed learners, but learners in general. So in general, when it comes to designing our instruction and designing our instructional materials, our PowerPoints, our worksheets, our assignments, everything, we want to minimize the extraneous load. And to do that, we want to avoid the use of anything that distracts the learner and makes the learning process difficult. That may be additional information. Maybe we don't need to provide the history of fractions. Maybe the student just needs to learn fractions. So we just need to minimize that load. And this is also kind of, extraneous load is another way to say overload, right? We just need to minimize the amount of materials we're giving our students and keep it as simple as possible, focused on the most pertinent pieces that are applicable to the outcomes, to what we want our students to be able to demonstrate and ultimately learn. So reducing all the extra. Let's get rid of all the extra. Manage the intrinsic load, refer to the inherent complexity of the learning materials. This is essentially the difficulty of the task that we really want them to do. Say they're learning fractions and we want them to add, subtract, multiply, divide. Those mathematical functions, the four, add, subtract, multiply, divide, are essentially what we want our students to really focus and struggle on. How to do it right, how to apply a process or a method that you explained it to them on how to do those mathematical functions. That's at the core, the complexity that our students need to be focused on, and what their time and effort needs to be focused on. So that's not something we can really minimize, but we do want to clarify and simplify, so that they are focused on that struggle at hand when they're working on it. And then maximize the germane load. And this is about what I'd mentioned before, just making sure your instructional materials, as your students are struggling with adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing fractions, you are providing clear and concise and as simple as possible instruction on the process of solving and doing those mathematical functions. So pretty simple little design here. I'm going to give you this slide deck in the announcement with this video, with this mini lecture video. So let's talk about 11 ways to reduce cognitive load and maximize learning when designing specifically instructional materials. So first one is break materials into subtasks and then build subtasks sequentially. Think about instructional design, or backward design, and the learning experiences. How can we give them little chunks and then towards the end of class build on it, right? To write an essay, we want them to come up with some arguments, maybe number those, prioritize those, then do some research, gather some more material to kind of back those arguments or those main points, and then make an outline that's a little bit higher level subtask, and then write the essay that's a little bit more of a higher level subtask. So thinking about chunking and building, I think of this as scaffolding. Number two, give an overview of the whole task and then focus on each subtask. So talk about that end goal, talk about the outcome of the essay, that kind of thing, and then clarify how the subtasks will get you there. This hits on adult learning theory and just being explicit about why we're doing things. Number three, provide worked examples. Solve problems with all steps shown and explained. That might be in your initial lecture, when you have the class work through one, or think about the old instructional phrase of I do, we do, you do. This is kind of like the I do and the we do of your instruction. Provide an example, talk through how you ended up at the solution, and then work through we do, have everybody do it together through one. So providing worked examples is a good idea. Number four, omit steps from a worked example to allow for independent problem solving. So how do we get from a list of bulleted essay outline to an essay that, what do they need to do in between, that kind of thing. That's a fun little step there that you can do. Number five, eliminate inessential information. So get rid of anything that is not that is over the top. So get rid of the history of an essay and just focus on writing an essay. Number six, group essential information. I think about the assignments and the assignment instructions. This is the section of the assignment instructions that are assignment requirements or assignment steps. So making sure to use subheaders in your assignment. Maybe you have assignment overview where you explain the big picture, assignment steps, the steps on what they need to do, and then assignment requirements. That would be a great way to design an assignment that's very clear and is grouped around essential information for students. Number seven, remove some written information to communicate verbally instead. This is a great space for us to build our instructor presence and relationship with students, is to not provide everything. Maybe there are some components that are required, right? In the example I just gave, the assignment instructions, maybe you don't do the assignment background, but you do include the assignment instructions and the assignment requirements. And maybe your assignment overview is something that you discuss verbally with students. That one's mixed because you want to make sure that you're giving requirements and steps of an assignment in paper form, so that they're not it doesn't just, you don't say it once and then they never hear it again. It's always present in written form. So that one's a little bit tricky, but do what you can with that where you can. Number 8, use short, simple spoken statements, just keeping it as simple as possible. Number 9, incorporate visual cues such as pointing. Plenty of examples there. Comprehensible input in the ESLs, in the English language learning space, where you're kind of like this actor on stage using lots of gestures and imagery to explain a scenario so that students begin to connect the language and the terminology, the words you're using, the phrases you're using with your actions and with these manipulatives and expressions that you're using, extrinsic expressions and that sort of thing. Number 10, encourage experienced students to visualize concepts already learned. So this gets back to how we move from the working memory to the long-term memory. It doesn't happen with one practice event or one practice learning experience. We need to have students play with and wrestle outcomes and new information in multiple ways. This is one way to do it. Encourage experienced students to visualize concepts already learned. And there's tons of ways you could do that. And then finally, focus tasking to avoid multitasking. Multitasking is a very heavy cognitive event. And it's interesting. This example, when I first heard it, I was like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. But it makes a lot of sense. Is the practice of note-taking during a lecture. They are attempting to listen to you, that's one task, and they're attempting to write it all down on a piece of paper, and they're trying to organize it into a meaningful fashion. There's like 3 different cognitive events occurring for your students when they are taking notes during a lecture or during a video. So what I would do in that specific case, so that it's focused tasking, is tell them, I'm going to give you time. I'm going to stop you during my lecture or this video so that you can take very specific notes. That's one way in that specific example to reduce it. But trying to get students to really focus on single tasking should be a focus of ours, especially in the adult ed space. Becomes even more difficult in a multi-level classroom, but that's a fun challenge to have. Many of you might be thinking about the note-taking thing that I was just talking about as, I don't know if that's true or not, because I do note-taking really well. Well, you are a practice educator and learner, and you have probably been doing that practice for many, many, many years, and you know how to do it successfully. Maybe you have certain note-taking annotations and things like that you use. So you're probably better off than your students. Not to say you can't teach the same practices you use, but remember that all learners are different, and that we helping them to not multitask early on when they don't have those set in stone successful learning behaviors is part of our work. So that's what I have for you. I've got some this is how it kind of connects placing cognitive load theory. It hits on explicit instruction, that direct instruction that you hear about. It leverages relevancy, we will talk about more about universal design for learning in the future, but it works on representation of novel instruction. That's when I was talking about all these different ways of having using gesture in the classroom and having students visualize what they've learned in the past, or maybe journal and reflect. That's all about representation, mental representation of new information or new instruction. So those are great ways to vary your instruction. And then Through this, we also have the opportunity, through applying those 11 hints and tips, we also have the opportunity to raise our teaching presence. This is especially important if you're teaching online. You want your students to have a sense and a feeling for you. It improves engagement and motivation in learners in an online environment. So that's what I've got for you. Here are some references. I will provide this slide deck with the video. I hope this was helpful, especially as we're talking about designing learning experiences, whether they are self-regulated or peer-to-peer, cognitive load theory, and making sure our instruction and our instructional materials are not overloading our students' memories. So